Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel Houseplanty Goodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it around me, it's tropical houseplants. Now today's topic is going to be slightly different than the usual, here's a plant, let's talk about it. And today I want to talk a bit more about listening to plant podcasts. And I don't know whether or not some of my followers already do this. Some of you probably already do. That's something that I really do enjoy listening to, usually when I'm doing things like plant chores. So that might be something that you might want to consider doing, putting in some headphones whilst you're going around watering your plants, propagating your plants, repotting your plants. It's a nice kind of way to be engaged with the activity that you're doing. I know a lot of us do something like a plant chore because it's relatively mindless and it's quite repetitive and it's a nice zen moment. And generally that's why I do it as well. And I would have assumed that something like a podcast might be a bit jarring, but actually it works really well. And you can also learn as you go along. I will hasten to add that what probably will happen as you listen to this podcast, especially if they're talking about plants that you've maybe not come across or you've never even heard of before, you probably will be stopping every so often to go onto your phone and just go, ooh, let's Google that plant and see what that looks like because it sounds interesting. So you've been warned about that essentially. But some of the podcasts that I want to talk about today are based all over the world. Mainly the three that I want to talk about today is either based in the UK or in the US. I'm sure there's other great houseplants, specifically houseplants. Obviously, there's loads of gardening podcasts, but houseplant podcasts were few and far between when I first started listening to them. There's more of them that have come around since then. But I want to talk about three that I listen to on a regular basis. And with that, let's start off with the first one, which is also a local podcast to the UK at least. And that is Jane Perrone, and the podcast is called On the Ledge Podcast. You can find, by the way, most of these podcasts on whatever podcast software that you use. I listen to most of mine actually on Spotify because it's nice and easy and I've already got it on there. But so Jane Perrone and On the Ledge Podcast is an amazing podcast. I think it might have actually been maybe the first or the second. There's another one that I'm going to talk about in a minute, which I'm not sure which one of the two I started listening to first. But Jane Perrone is very cool with what she talks about. She's very knowledgeable. If I'm not mistaken, she's also a journalist within the field. I think she started off as a bit of a gardening journalist. She's also very active within the community, at least here in the UK. So she'll do a lot of talks at different plant-related events. And she's very knowledgeable in terms of her houseplants. And it's really interesting because she's always expanding the knowledge that she has, and she kind of takes you along for the ride. She's building a great community as well within that podcast as well. So she's always got audience members coming in and maybe talking about what plant they might save if it's a burning building. And she kind of gets the audience and the kind of community involved a bit more, which I think is really, really cool. She's also, I think, recently, she was recently going for funding to get her first book out. And if I'm not mistaken, that's been funded. I have also pledged for that. So I'm looking forward to getting that book at some point. But Jane Perrone, very cool. You also get occasional mentions of Wolfie, which is her dog, which is always quite entertaining to kind of listen to that as well and some of the interactions there. And yeah, just really, really awesome. She's got an amazing accent from over here. I can't ever place where Jane's accent is from, but definitely one that I think that most people would enjoy. So On the Ledge Podcast with Jane Perrone. The second podcast that I really, really enjoy listening to is Plant Daddy Podcast. And again, as I've mentioned before, you can find this on your podcast software of choice. So the Plant Daddy Podcast is two podcasters, and it's Matthew and Stephen, and they're based in the States. And they are very, very cool with the way that they run their podcast because you see two different angles as well. Matthew and Stephen care for their plants in very different ways. They also have passions for different types of plants. So for instance, Matthew would be more of the tropical foliage plant and the aroids and down that route. And Stephen's kind of big passions tend to be with carnivorous plants and cactuses and succulents. And I think the thing that does bring both of them together is that they both have a real interest in orchids as well. So a very, very cool podcast to listen to. It's nice to see the banter that happens between the two guys. And they don't just necessarily always talk about plants. There are other aspects of their lives that come in, or possibly some of the current affairs as well. But generally speaking, it tends to be more about the tropical plants that they care for. They'll talk about their opinions about some of the hyped plants. Matthew, for instance, very controversially said that he didn't like variegated plants for a long time. I think he's kind of come around to some variegated plants now, which was quite cool. But both Matthew and Stephen do a lot of research into what they're talking about, and you can really see that come through, because if you're a bit of a planty, sciencey geek like I am, you will love their podcast because they'll kind of dive into it a bit more. And the same thing goes for Jane as well. And Jane will come up with scientific terms as well, like things like guttation, which I've also done a video about on my channel. But Matthew and Stephen and Plant Daddy podcast, very, very cool. I think Matthew and Stephen and Jane Perrone have actually also done an episode together as well. So that was mind blown. But very, very cool podcast to listen to as well. Slightly different from Jane's, but similar in many ways as well. Last but not least is Maria with Bloom and Grow Radio. And Maria, again, is based in the States, if I'm not mistaken as well. Her background prior to the podcast, and I think the podcast is now her main, essentially her main work, and what she does for a living essentially now. She was previously a performer, I think, in Broadway. Can't remember if it was just on musicals, but if it was also theatre as well. But Maria, one of the reasons why I enjoy, and Maria or Jane Perrone were the two podcasts, and I'm not sure which one I started listening to first. So all three of these podcasts have got several episodes. So if you like to binge on a podcast the same way that you would binge on a series on Netflix, all three of these are great options, because if you haven't listened to any of them, there's loads of episodes for you to catch up on. But Maria is just really got this sense of excitement about the plants as well. She talks about her journey, how she used to kill plants when she first got into everything. And you can see when you listen to her podcast from the beginning, how she improves and how she learns things and how she puts things into action. And it's a very real way of kind of looking at houseplants. The other two podcasts tend to be from individuals that really get into the geeky scientific side of things, and Maria does to a certain point as well. But Maria is very much, with Bloom and Grow Radio, is very much championing people who don't necessarily want to go into the scientific side of things. They do want to learn along the way, and she talks about great things like lighting levels and all of these things, and she brings guests on a regular basis onto her podcast who are kind of big within the industry. And actually, not give the other two podcast credits as well, so does Jane Perrone and so does Matthew and Stephen, but it's just Maria's exuberance in terms of how she talks about the houseplants, how she'll get excited about different things that she's learning along the way. So all three of these podcasts are great ones to listen to whilst you're doing your plant chores. You don't have to do it whilst you're listening to your plant chores. I also used to listen to it when I used to commute into work, just because it's a nice way to kind of hear more about your big passion, hopefully if it's the same as mine, and just have a laugh along the way, because all three podcasters are also quite funny at times as well, and they'll laugh at situations or themselves as well. So great podcast to listen to. And obviously I will say this, but I'm not a big enough YouTuber to be sponsored by any of these people, and I'm not. So hashtag this is not sponsored, but very cool podcast to listen to if you want to get into more houseplanty podcasts. But yeah, I'd encourage you in the comments down below to ask any questions, maybe share any podcasts that I've not mentioned here, and share it with the community as well, just because I'm sure, as well as I would like to find out some new podcasts to listen to, other people might do as well. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.